And that's President Cyril Ramaphosa earlier speaking at an engagement with the legal fraternity at the Intergovernmental National Litigation Forum. European Union leaders have agreed on a new package of sanctions against Russia, which they say will have severe consequences on Moscow. Russia launched an all-out invasion of Ukraine by land, air and sea yesterday. Reports are now coming in of several explosions in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. The country's interior ministry has called for every citizen to take up arms to defend their homes, with at least 137 people having already been killed. For more on the story, we cross live now to SABC News correspondent Rosie Birchard. A very good day to you, Rosie. What's the latest?
Well, the latest is EU leaders were up almost all night trying to agree on a way forward in this most complex of situations they're really trying to keep up with the speed of how things are developing. As you said, they've agreed on sanctions which they say are massive and which they say will be painful for the Russian economy. They are essentially trying to cut or severely limit Russian banks' access to raising capital on EU markets. However, they left some things up their sleeve. They said they are already working on a third package of sanctions, and that has led some critics to ask, what are they waiting for? There is already a war underway on the EU's doorstep, and I think that very kind of the pure geography of the thing here, there are 4 EU countries which share a border with Ukraine, and they certainly were saying yesterday at these talks that they feel very exposed. They are also, among other EU leaders, preparing for potential influx of displaced people, and the EU is also discussing more support it can offer to Ukraine. However, Ukraine has said this is not enough. It wants stronger sanctions. It says the sanctions that are currently in place have not been enough to deter Russia, which definitely does seem to be the case. As we heard from your previous guest, this operation is ongoing, and of course EU leaders in Brussels here were pointing to the loss of life on the Ukrainian side among civilians. They are very concerned about this situation, which seems to be speeding well ahead of their pace as they try to catch up with sanctions. That's already the second package of sanctions in 2 days here in Brussels.
EU leaders being very decisive and using very strong language, saying the EU stands by Ukraine and its people, and that these actions by Russia target the stability of Europe. Just give us a sense of Europeans on the ground, just how they're responding to these events.
Well, I could tell you here in Brussels, for example, yesterday there were several demonstrations of people who were in support of Ukraine, or of course Ukrainians themselves that live here in Belgium. Now, as I mentioned, the European Union is also home to a number of countries which share a border with Ukraine or share a border with Russia, and I think the geography really dictates that this feels much closer to home for them. So elsewhere in Europe, people also worrying about what kind of effect this could have on their lives and their pockets, because no sanctions come without pain. When the European Union is sanctioning Russia, there will very likely be counter sanctions from Russia, and that could affect the people's bills, that could affect industries, that could affect European businesses, and that's potentially why we also saw the European Union or EU member states holding back on some of these sanctions, because they are anticipating what kind of countermeasures could come and the impact that could have on economies and businesses here. So very much top of people's minds here. Of course, it must be said, in many ways, life still goes on. Here in the buildings behind me, officials are busy drafting the next round of sanctions, trying to plot out what move might come next and trying to anticipate what Russia's next move might be. And that's something they simply don't know.
We know that the European Union mainly focuses on policy, but just do you know of any official EU processes that have kicked in just in efforts to help civilians?
Well, we know that the EU has set aside fresh money for humanitarian support, and we know that the EU over the last few weeks unveiled a 1.2 billion euro support package to the Ukraine in the form of grants and loans. But it must be said, none of that has seemed to change the situation insofar as, of course, things have progressed towards that state of conflict that they're now in. I think what's also interesting is here in Brussels we have two major institutions, so the European Union, but also NATO, that major defensive alliance with 30 allies of which the United States is part. And Ukraine has been calling for a clear perspective on joining both of these organizations. How can it progress towards entering into those folds? And that's something which neither organization has been able to provide clarity on so far. The leaders from the EU were in fact at their talks overnight, joined briefly by video conference by the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, and he specifically made that request to them. He said, I would like to join. How can we do this? And according to him, at least, his assessment of the situation, there was silence in the room. So that is certainly something we're hearing more of from Ukraine. There are some EU members that are more strident on this, particularly these Baltic states, and Poland, for example, have issued a request to other leaders to try and better support a European perspective for Ukraine. But all of this comes amid a conflict where there is also loss of life on the ground. So these political questions are very much being overshadowed by this crisis, which is ongoing. And in fact, we heard from French President Macron yesterday. He wants to clarify. He said, this is not a crisis, this is a war.
Yeah. Rosie, the Western countries seem very much to be involved in this process, but the Ukrainian president coming out to say that Ukrainians are on their own. How is NATO responding to this? How is it assisting the Ukraine?
Well, that's a great question. NATO leaders are due to meet virtually this afternoon. We know Joe Biden, the President of the United States, will be there virtually, French President Macron, German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, and they will be putting their head together to try and plot the next move. We know that NATO allies will be likely further reinforcing deployments on the alliance's eastern flank, so that's countries like Poland or Romania. However, they've been very clear they will not be sending NATO troops into Ukraine, so no NATO boots on the ground in Kyiv, and that's potentially why we see this message that Ukraine is feeling alone. That is precisely because Ukraine is not a member of NATO, and that means it's not party to the alliance's collective defence agreements. That's that one-for-all pledge which says that if one ally is threatened, it can expect defensive support from others. That's something Ukraine cannot rely on, and that is certainly a source of worry for Ukraine, especially, as I mentioned, they're trying to get a clearer perspective on NATO membership. However, NATO leaders will today be discussing ways they can better support Ukraine. That might involve sending weapons. That might have, in the past, it certainly involved, for example, military training, though no boots on the ground, as I've mentioned. So they'll be plotting the way ahead on that, and we do expect to hear more from NATO on its plans of how better to support Ukraine within the coming hours. We'll certainly get back to you if there's any breakthroughs there, but one thing Ukraine is likely not going to be able to expect, as I mentioned, is any NATO boots on the ground in its country.
We'll be awaiting that update. Thank you so much for your time, Rosie Birchard. As we said, a developing story, and we continue to watch events as they unfold.